So I'm going to introduce the first speaker in the first session. The session is called Inside the Secretive World of Tax Avoidance Experts. It's being presented by Brooke Harrington, an associate professor at Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. And Brooke did extensive research. She visited many offshore financial centers, from memory, I don't know, 18 or so. She trained to be a wealth manager, I believe specifically for the purpose of conducting research. So she has something of an insider's look into this very important and very lucrative area of international finance. So, Brooke, are you around?
You can hear me? Good. So I want to echo where David started here, which is to say, just like with offshore, not all things that happen in wealth management are bad or good. And I'm sort of not coming from the perspective of trying to condemn anyone. As a sociologist, I'm just interested in finding out who makes things work and how they do it. So with that, I gave some thought after the reception last night to the fact that there are a number of people in this audience who are themselves wealth managers. And I thought, what on earth can I say to people who practice in this field? Since although I did gain the credential to be a wealth manager, I never practiced. Sort of like getting a medical degree without doing an internship or a residency. You wouldn't want me performing surgery on you or your loved ones. So I thought about the case of Alexandre de Tocqueville, a Frenchman who came to study the United States in the early years of the Republic. And we still read him in America because there's something interesting about an outsider's perspective on your own world. So I hope that's what I can offer to the wealth management practitioners in the audience today. For those of you who are on the enforcement side, I hope you will find some value in my analysis of the social and political economic forces that underpin wealth management, as well as tactics and techniques. So with that, I want to start with, of course, with the thing that's been on everyone's mind for the last month, which is the Panama Papers. Everyone has an idea about what we should learn from those things, but my perspective is that one of the things that they tell us is that the focus of public policy efforts and a lot of public discussion about wealth management and offshore has been perhaps misplaced on wealthy people themselves. I think it should shift from economic elites, the people who benefit from the use of offshore, to the people who actually make it work, which is to say the professionals who operate the system. And I think there's some dawning awareness of this on the part of policymakers, because the Secretary General of the OECD, Angel Gurria, was just quoted in The Guardian a couple weeks ago saying, in response to the Panama Papers, nothing at all about wealthy people, but a lot about the lawyers and accountants and bankers and other people who make up the wealth management profession as the persons of most interest to the world of policymaking. So in some ways, I think that's a smart development. In other words, this is not to say that without companies like Mossack Fonseca and the wealth managers they employ, that tax avoidance or tax evasion would disappear. Certainly not. What I think is true is that we couldn't have the scope and complexity of the system that we see operating now without the intervention of professionals. So my claims about this are based on 8 years that I spent studying the field. And that started with what David already mentioned, which is 2 years to gain the Trust and Estate Practitioner credential from STEP. I'm sure many of you are aware here of STEP as an organization. Some of you may be members. You may know that you're not allowed to attend their professional society meetings held all over the world unless you either have a credential or are training to get one. So getting the credential served several functions for me, which I'll discuss in a minute. Basically, what I was able to do at the end of this 8 years was collect 65 interviews with practitioners in 18 countries. By no means a representative sample of the whole profession, but it's a start. And what I was hoping to do by going to these 18 different jurisdictions was to get a sense of how the practice of wealth management varies over places and over the scope of 8 years, which commenced just before, about a year before the financial crisis. So I got a snapshot of the before and after the apocalypse, so to speak. What I want to talk about this morning is a couple things. First of all, how and why I did the study. I didn't expect that to be of interest to anyone, but as I've started publishing on this work, both in the academic world and in the popular press, it's come to my attention that the hows and whys of the study itself are a matter of interest. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll also talk about 3 key things that I, as an outsider, learned about wealth managers. To some extent, I can talk about how they work, mostly from the point of view of what you are taught to do and how you are taught to think when you go through the credentialing program. I'm sure several people in this audience, if not many, are much better informed than I on questions of how the current practice operates in various jurisdictions, and you'll be hearing from some of them later in the conference. But I can speak to the issue of how people are taught to think in the credentialing program. I'm also going to answer what end up being the 2 most common questions I get when I speak on this study to non-practitioners. And this may be a bit of a surprise to some of you. One of the questions that I get is, how do wealth managers see themselves? What do they think that they're doing? And the other is, why isn't a stop put to this by various government authorities? So, with that in mind, let me start with the whys. Why should anyone study wealth management? Well, as a sociologist, a couple of things came to my attention as being of interest. Long before there were Panama Papers, and even long before there were leaks in Luxembourg and Liechtenstein, there was evidence that inequality was growing rapidly in a way that no one could really explain. It just was happening. So this is a diagram that was produced by Credit Suisse, and Oxfam and other organizations have produced similar diagrams showing that now in 2016 we have a situation where 1% of the world's population owns 50% of its wealth. That's a pretty dramatic transformation that's occurred in a relatively small period of time. So as a sociologist, what I want to know about that is who made it happen. It's not so much of interest to me to say, as an Oxfam would, oh, who are these bad people, let's track them down. I just want to know how. Who are the actors in this? So another issue that has come to our attention, again, long before the Panama Papers leak, is tax avoidance by the wealthy. And those of you who remember the 2012 presidential election probably remember a diagram like this that came out after Mr. Romney was obliged to disclose his tax returns as part of his presidential campaign. So we see that there are a number of trusts, with the exception of the Swiss account, there are question marks on the assets, the scope, and content of all of those accounts all over the world. So again, who made that happen? Who does that? It's not Mr. Romney. He doesn't manage it. In fact, his wealth manager was named in the New York Times. But that didn't really receive very much attention. It was treated as if this is something that Romney himself is doing. Like he personally decided that he only wanted to pay 13.9% taxes on his fortune. Obviously not the case. That's not news to most of the people in this room, but that is definitely news to most people who aren't practitioners. So a third issue that I find fascinating and is very poorly understood among members of the public is debt avoidance too. To some extent, people are aware of wealth management as a profession and a practice only through the lens of tax avoidance. But of course, as many of you know, there's this whole other world of debt avoidance too. So my favorite example of this is my Illinois homeboy, Kevin Trudeau, who had a judgment of $37.5 million leveled against him in federal court for fraud in 2007. And at least as of this morning, the mighty US government has been essentially powerless to retrieve any of those assets because he had a wealth manager who stashed that $37.5 million or more, for all we know, in a Cook Islands Asset Protection Trust. It's effectively untouchable. I want to know who made that happen. So if you're in academia, and even if you just pick up a paper as a member of the public, and you want to know answers to this question of who are the key actors in all of this, you get one of two usual suspects. One is the state. It's the state's fault. They make the policies, they screwed up, fix the policy, then you solve the problem. I don't entirely disagree with that. And of course, as I mentioned, the rich are often mentioned as the prime movers in all of this. Again, I don't completely disagree with that. They're the ones paying for the services. My point is that this account is incomplete, and it leaves out this essential group of professional actors who make their living in part by being discreet and low profile, and they've been very successful at it until recently. The Panama Papers have started to bring their work to attention, but without them, I argue, the scope and complexity of the world we see now offshore, it wouldn't be possible. So that's the significance of Mossack Fonseca. That's how they carve out their niche in the world political economy. So who are these people? For those of you in the audience who are not from the profession, a quick review. As a profession, it's fairly new in terms of the characteristics that define a profession. Wealth management itself has been practiced for a long time. You could even trace it back to the Middle Ages in England when trusts were first developed. But those people who acted as trustees were not professionals. They were other noblemen. They were to the manor born. They were amateurs. In fact, as many of you probably know, until recently, well, recently as in the last 100, 150 years, it was not possible to get paid for your work being a trustee. It was written into many English legal texts that it was a burden upon the honor and conscience of a gentleman to act as a trustee for a close associate. So the courts had to make it possible, and ultimately statute law had to make it possible for wealth managers to accept a fee for their work. And it was only in 1991 that STEP, the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners, which is based in London, was created. So that's a very new trajectory for formal professionalization. Think about medicine or the law itself. Those professions were institutionalized at least 100 years before wealth management. Lawyers and doctors had things like bar associations and medical associations, and they were licensed by the state, which is a crucial distinction that still remains between the profession of wealth management and other professions. But that all happened a century or more before wealth management started to establish itself. In fact, it's only since, I think, 2013 that it was possible to get a degree in wealth management. STEP has partnered with the University of Manchester in the UK to create a degree program for undergraduates in wealth management. But until recently, you couldn't go to school in this. You had to start as a lawyer or a banker or an accountant and then find your way in to specializing in working with high net worth clients or working on offshore. So that's one of the ways that this profession has escaped public attention for a long time. It's simply operated under the radar without any of the formal institutions that signal a presence. Of course, their specialty, the thing that unites these people who have trained in different professions, is the ability to keep wealth out of the hands of people who want to sink their teeth into it. That might include the state, but it's certainly not limited to the state. As those of you who work with clients from the Arab Peninsula know, they don't have so many worries about taxation, but they have a lot of worries about things like Sharia law, about their own families trying to seize their wealth. So that creates some issues for wealth management that have nothing to do with tax. One of the things that makes it a fascinating profession to study is that it's so very diverse. In a way, it's a shame that tax avoidance gets the bulk of the media attention because there's so much going on. Of the 65 people I talked to, many of them said, when I asked them, can you characterize your job for me in one sentence, would say things like, I'm a social worker for the rich. And what they meant by that is that in addition to the technical aspects of their job, which are quite complex, there are many social and social psychological aspects to it, like mediating family disputes, which can be quite vicious at times. One of the gentlemen I spoke to in London said, you know, I'm wealth manager for an elderly client with dementia, and her children, her adult children, are pushing very hard to get her moved from the costly nursing home where she is currently living to a less costly nursing home, because to the extent that they can hasten her death and reduce the costs of care for her, they inherit more. And the only person standing between her and that fate is me, because essentially I have nothing to gain. In fact, it's in my interests that she live and live as comfortably as possible for as long as possible. And those interests are in conflict with those of her own family. So it's a very interesting combination of traits that you rarely see in any professional work. High technical demands in terms of mastery of law and accountancy and so forth. And then also psychological and emotional skills, emotional intelligence, as Daniel Goleman called it in his best-selling book of a couple years ago. You rarely see these things combined. In medicine, think about all the stereotypes of surgeons. You don't go to the surgeon who's the nicest guy. You go to the surgeon who is the most technically skilled. And if he's a jerk to you, well, then so be it. My dad's a surgeon, so I know a little bit about the stereotypes that affect medicine. And like, no one expects the surgeon to be a nice person. But people do expect their wealth managers to have a level of emotional and social competence that you usually only see in the helping professions. So this is part of the fascination of the field that I think deserves more attention. So I wrote in an article for The Atlantic recently that one of the things that people should be paying more attention to in the Panama Papers is really how little of what has outraged the public is illegal. Consider Icelandic Prime Minister Sigurdur Gunnlaugsson. This is a man who, as far as anyone knows, has not done anything illegal. He was pelted with yogurt in front of the Icelandic parliament, however, because what he'd done, which was acting as the person who negotiated the settlement of the bankrupt Icelandic banking system with its creditors, he should have disclosed, the public said, that his wife was the owner of one of the businesses, an offshore business incorporated by Mossack Fonseca, that was going to benefit from that restructuring of the Icelandic banking system. So an ethical lapse, perhaps, but nothing illegal. Even his strongest critics didn't accuse him of doing anything illegal. Nonetheless, he had to step down as prime minister, and who knows if he will ever have a political career in his country again. That's a pretty stiff penalty to pay for not breaking any laws. So my point in this Atlantic article was, isn't it interesting that one of the things that is part of this specialty is making sure that your clients stay on the right side of the law. They may violate the law in spirit, but one of the reasons you pay a wealth manager is to stay on the right side of the law to the letter. And that's an important distinction, as long as people still go to jail and pay big fines for breaking the letter of the law. And as I've alluded to, tax avoidance is just the tip of the iceberg. I wish some of the other issues got more attention, because they're part of what makes this such a fascinating profession. So how I studied them. Well, what I didn't do was go undercover, because unlike journalists who can do that routinely without penalty, you can't be an academic and go undercover these days. Maybe 40 years ago you could get away with it, but if you try that now, you suffer the ultimate penalty, which is inability to publish. And that's the currency of my profession, is publication. So if you say, I did not disclose my research intent to the people I was studying, that's it, game over, you can't publish. So no one wants to do that, I didn't do that. So I trained as a wealth manager. Anybody can do it if you have sufficient amounts of time and money. And I had a unique constellation of circumstances. I'd been a professor at Brown University in the US for about 6 years, and I went on something called a sabbatical, which is a one-year break to do research that you get every 7 years. So I went to Germany to a think tank called the Max Planck Institute just to finish my first book, which I did, but I also discovered that the head of that Max Planck Institute had himself just published a major book on inherited wealth, which had long been a subject of interest for me, but I couldn't figure out a way to study it, because in America, social science research is not very well funded, and I knew it was going to be an expensive project to conduct. So I suddenly found myself face to face with someone who could give me the time and the money to do this sort of blue sky study that I'd always wanted to do, or at least wanted to do for about the last 10 years. The German government, to my great good fortune, throws buckets of money at basic social science research. So instead of taking a sabbatical, I took 4 years at the Max Planck Institute, and during that time, I got the funding in time to train to be a wealth manager. I could never have done that in the US, so it was just serendipity that made it possible. But I was still technically a professor the whole time. So I went mostly to Switzerland and Liechtenstein to take the courses for STEP certification. And as at this conference, everyone who was part of those courses wore a name badge. And I wore a badge just like everyone else with my real name and institutional affiliation. Fortunately, the Max Planck Institute doesn't have that much name recognition outside of academia. So people sort of gave me a glance and thought, maybe that's some small-time boutique firm. The people who did ask, I told them the truth. I said, I'm a sociologist, I'm interested in what you do, and so I'm just taking this opportunity to train, to learn about the field, which was the truth. Many people who heard that I was doing this study in its early stages thought, there is no way in the world that any of these people will ever talk to you. Just forget about it. It's a wild goose chase. And to be honest, I didn't know whether it would work. But I did realize that cold calling people, saying, hello, I'm a sociologist, would you like to talk to me? Would get a or if I contacted them by email, I would just never hear anything again. I decided to exploit the fact that I had some advantages in going face-to-face with people. There's a gentleman at Columbia, also a sociologist, who wrote a book that was a bestseller a couple years ago, unusual for academic books. It was called Gang Leader for a Day. Anyone here heard of it? Well, this was a study, a dissertation research piece that was done by a man who is an Indian American, quite dark-skinned, and this played into his ability to blend in with the gangs of my hometown of Chicago. So he basically decided that he was going to understand gang life from the inside by joining them. And he was able to do that because he looked more like them than most sociologists did. I don't think I would have been able to do that study. I simply looked too different. But the same things that would make it impossible for me to do an insider study of gang life made it easier for me than it would have been for this gentleman to do an insider study of wealth management. Being white helps. Being a native English speaker helps. Probably being female helped. I'm not sure. I don't have the opportunity to try it any other way, but I figured if I could get face-to-face with people and show them that I wasn't a big scary ogre who was out to expose or embarrass them, I might have a shot. It was a gamble, but it turned out to be mostly correct. Very few people turned me down when I asked them for interviews face-to-face, and they saw that my butt was in the chair right along with theirs, learning about tax law and trust law and how to invest for high net worth clients. And we were all in the same hotels together. We were eating all of our meals together. That tends to breed a certain foxhole-style camaraderie. And lo and behold, people just started telling their war stories. I have a theory about this, and it was inspired by the fact that I'm still, even though the study has been concluded for almost a year, I still get emails from strangers in wealth management wanting to tell me their stories. This is quite unexpected, but I think the idea is that why someone might want to speak to a sociologist is connected with the idea that all of us have deeply technical aspects of our work that nobody wants to hear about. Our families are sick and tired of it. Many of our peers who would understand, well, you don't know how they'd use the information about the bad day that we had or the good day that we had. You don't want to come off badly to your peers. They could use it against you. But if someone comes along and they know a good deal about the technical aspects of your work, enough to understand why you had a particularly good day or why your war story is funny, but they are not a professional competitor, they have no way to hold anything against you, that sort of invites discourse. people have a lot of sort of stories that they'd like to unload and not a lot of safe places to unload them. So 65 people decided to unload on me, and I was grateful for it. I think it was largely a win-win. And as I say, when people find out that I've done this study, I am still getting contacted by people I've never met, basically just wanting to tell me about their day as a wealth manager. I was never employed in practice, but I did use the credential to get access to knowledge that is difficult to access in other ways. You know, the frontier of wealth management advances so quickly that by the time someone publishes a book about it, it's probably out of date. And if you want to go follow that frontier, you have to go to the professional society meetings, but you can't do that unless you have the credential. So this was my ticket to get face-to-face with as many people as possible around the world and ask them to talk to me. So this is where I went. It was expensive to do this, to visit all these countries, and that's part of why the whole study took 8 years, piecing together a patchwork of research funding to get to these places. But it was fascinating. The Cook Islands in particular were harrowing, but fascinating. Some of the more remote places were a little scary. I've traveled all over the world by myself for holiday purposes, and I've never felt as endangered as I was in the Cook Islands and, oddly enough, in the Seychelles. So I told you I would speak about the key things that I learned as a sociologist. One of the things I learned is that wealth managers are at the cutting edge of financial legal innovation in the world. As I mentioned, the technical demands of the job are quite high. And when people ask me, people who are not in the profession say, what would you do if I came to you with $100 million? What would you advise me to do? And one of the things I say is, well, don't put all your eggs in one basket. If you want to spend 10 minutes online and open yourself an offshore corporation, that's fine, but don't put all your assets in there. The name of the game, if you want to be judgment-proof, is to scatter. Find the jurisdictions that are most suitable for whatever your aims are and whatever your assets are, and then scatter as widely as possible. Make it hard for people to find it. So you create these mazes composed of corporations, trusts, and foundations, often stacked together. And you use structures that leave as little public footprint as possible. So for example, you've probably all read about how people who want to stash assets in the US will end up using shell corporations to buy properties in New York City. And they don't get mortgages on them. They buy them for cash. So there's no mortgage paperwork. The owner is publicly listed as a corporation offshore with nominee shareholders and directors. So anything that would normally allow you to trace ownership is obscured intentionally. The more you obscure, the more difficult you make it to trace accountability for taxes, but not just for taxes, for things like alimony payments or dispositions to your heirs or repayment to your creditors. From a political point of view, one of the things that I think makes wealth management so interesting is a dual relationship that wealth management has with the state. I mentioned earlier that as a profession, wealth management is very unusual in not requiring state licensure. You know, doctors, lawyers, accountants, none of them can practice in any given jurisdiction without state licensure. And so there's always the threat that if they step outside the lines, their licensure can be revoked. That's not the case for wealth management. There is no state licensure in most places of the world. So if you go to the UK, you can't get state certification as a wealth manager. That's very strategically useful because it takes away a form of sanctioning that's otherwise very powerful for professionals. The word arbitrage comes to mind when we think about state boundaries and the way they're used by wealth managers. It would not be useful to have a world. Is Ms. Atosian here in the room? Hi. Your book was, I've cited it in my book actually. Ms. Atosian, who will talk later, is has a very interesting book that looks at sort of the end of state boundaries and what that could mean for the world. And I don't think that would be very much in the interests of wealth managers, because the game is to arbitrage state boundaries against one another, to make use of conflicts of laws among states and to find the gaps in laws among states. If you took state boundaries away, the game would largely be over. You know, in 1648, those of you who studied European history know that there was a seminal event called the Treaty of Westphalia. And that was sort of formed the basis of our modern political economy. State boundaries were formed, and the rule was no state was obliged to enforce the laws of any other state. Seems simple enough. That worked great when there was low mobility in the world, low mobility of capital and low mobility of people. Well, we're not in 1648 anymore. Capital and people, at least a certain segment of the world's population, are highly mobile, and that is making the Westphalian system start to break down. And certainly it can be hacked rather easily. It's like an outdated computer system with a lot of security vulnerabilities. For people who are ultra rich, the 14 million, I believe, 14 million people in the world are classified as high net worth, meaning that they have 1 million or more in investable assets. I think about 168,000 are considered ultra high net worth, which means they have 30 million US or more in investable assets. For those people, the old Westphalian system of national boundaries and national obligations are not constraints the way they are for the rest of us. They are shopping opportunities. Where would you like to put your assets? Where would you like to have your citizenship? What is most strategically useful for you? If the strategic utility of being a citizen of country X is no longer useful for you, you simply get citizenship in country Y. Problem solved. As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the most common questions I get from people outside the wealth management profession is they want to understand from a human point of view how professionals in this field think of themselves and their work. Having studied only 65 people, I can't give you a comprehensive or even remotely representative account, and I don't claim to. What I can provide is a sense of what these 65 people see in the world, which is an acute awareness that to the extent people know about their work at all, they're regarded in a negative way. It hurts their feelings. And, you know, understandably so. No one wants to be seen as a bad person doing bad things. Since the 1970s, we've known from social psychology that there's a basic human motivation to be seen as good or to think of yourself as a good person. So this is not a welcome stereotype. What's interesting is how people in the practice see themselves from the inside. And a significant number see themselves like this. Amazingly enough, this is, I didn't concoct that image. That's actually taken straight from a professional journal called the Step Journal in November 2014. I remember when I got the journal, I flipped it open to look at the articles, and I saw this, and I just stopped dead in my tracks, because I just published an article about the medieval origins and the somewhat medieval style ethic of the profession in terms of, say, fiduciary responsibility. So there are a certain number of people, certainly among those that I interviewed, who really see themselves as heroic defenders of wealth. And I would say, while not every practitioner sees themselves that way, that is in some ways the dominant perspective you get in the teaching materials. And I want to read you a quote from the STEP training manual that I read. When I was doing my studies, sometimes I would be stopped dead and just laugh out loud at some of the things that were written in these training manuals, because they're so brassy. Listen to this. Onerously high, some may say unethical tax demands to finance generous government spending clearly act as a chill upon the entrepreneur, as a creator of wealth. Whereas, on the other hand, the poor may be caught in a poverty trap and rely on state welfare handouts rather than engage in productive work. So you see what they're saying in these training manuals is it's a moral justification for wealth management and also for legal tax avoidance. What they're saying is, if the rich were to pay the confiscatory tax rates demanded by contemporary welfare states, it would create a moral hazard for the poor. It would teach them dependence on the state. And there were, in fact, a significant minority of the 65 people I interviewed who seriously believed that. One elegant gentleman in London whom I interviewed said, "You must understand, my clients are like hardworking squirrels who have put their nuts away and the government comes and digs them up and steals them. So the squirrels say to themselves, I shouldn't gather any more nuts because the government just takes them away. But I'm here to protect those squirrels, those wealth creators." It was one of those moments where I was simultaneously thanking my lucky stars as a researcher and struggling mightily to keep a straight face. You haven't lived until you've seen an elegantly dressed man in a three-piece suit and a pinky ring discourse to you upon his clients as vulnerable little forest creatures. I'd say the majority of the 65 I interviewed thought of what they did in very sort of narrow terms. They didn't consider the broader implications of their work at all. When I asked them, what's important about your work, what do you like about it, what they said is, I help families. And they weren't wrong about that. They weren't lying. I mean, if you think about the example I gave you a few minutes ago about the gentleman who was standing between his elderly client with dementia and her money-hungry heirs, there's truth to this. They're also helping families who live in countries with unstable political situations. People I talked to in Argentina who said, look, we have this government that is prone to come and confiscate people's assets. And oh, by the way, they're not managing our economy very well, so our inflation eats away at anything we try to save. So the only sensible thing to do is put assets in dollars offshore, because otherwise you're going to lose about 30% a year if you just stand still. So I'm trying to prevent people from losing what they've earned. And if you work with clients in Brazil, anyone can just walk into the Brazilian tax authority, and for the equivalent of about $100 US, you can pay to get the names of all the people who have filed tax returns showing that they make a lot of money, and then you go out and you kidnap them or their family members for ransom. Nobody wants to be that person, so in order to help them avoid that kind of criminal activity, you've got to get their money offshore. So I'm sympathetic to that. I'm glad someone does that job. It's until those governments straighten themselves out, it would be best, I think probably we could all agree, even the people who are most hostile to wealth management and tax avoidance could probably agree that it's better that fewer people get kidnapped than more. Then there was a very interesting group of people I didn't expect to find that I would describe as the conscience-stricken. One of them actually was from Mossack Fonseca. So when the Panama Papers leak hit, the first thing I thought was, wow, I wonder if it was done by this guy I talked to. These people really do think about the broader impacts of what they do, and they don't feel great about it. It's a living for them, they enjoy it, they're good at it, but they see that tax avoidance is not necessarily a great thing for the world, or they're troubled by what they call the lawlessness of their clients, and they try to offset it in various ways. One of the people I interviewed, the guy in Panama, said, I get face-to-face with well-to-do clients, and I do what they want me to do in terms of protecting their assets, but in return for that, I take the opportunity to do some consciousness raising with them. I talk to them about inequality and their role in this broader system. I encourage them to give to charity. I heard that from several people, that they tried to offset what they regarded as damage to states by encouraging their clients to donate generously in philanthropic ways. So, final question that I learned about, why governments don't simply put a stop to this. We certainly hear a lot of noise about putting a stop to this. Do you remember it was almost 3 years ago exactly at the G8 summit that David Cameron got up in front of a group of his colleagues and said, you know what we really need? We need a register of beneficial ownership open to the public. Has anything been done along those lines? I wonder why. Well, at the personal level as well as institutionally, the people who have the power to really crack down on this are up to their eyeballs embedded in this offshore system. Mr. Cameron being the prime example. It's unfortunate that someone who publicly called out other citizens of the British Empire for using offshore strategies was himself found to be a beneficiary, however indirectly, of his father's offshore activity. As I point out to people often, though, even if you could imagine a UK premier, or really the premier of any major country, who had absolutely no connection to the offshore world, you might be hard-pressed to find someone like that, but imagine that you could. It's very unlikely that anybody would want to be the person to turn off the economic taps, the profits that flow into a country from acting as a tax haven. As we all know, the City of London is one of the world's most important spots for this activity. So several of the people I spoke to in London as part of my study said, look, it's never going to happen. You're never going to see the UK following through on any of its initiatives or any of its threats to shut down tax haven activity, because we are a tax haven. And to the extent that that is restricted in any way, much less shut down, the UK economy will suffer. And nobody wants to be the guy who does that, because they're going to lose their political career in the process. No matter what people say about wanting to stop this, they don't want their economy to slow down, and they don't want their property values to decline. And that's what would happen if we got really serious about putting a stop to this. Also, as some of you may know, wealth managers themselves have a great deal of power in shaping the laws to which they themselves are subject. So in the onshore world, the gentleman I just mentioned who talked about London as a tax haven said that his firm had one of the few parliamentary agents in the UK. Now, a parliamentary agent is a person with special powers in the legal system to go directly address the parliament and provide counsel and advice. So they can go to the parliament and represent the interests of their high net worth clients, many of whom may not even live in the UK. But they can influence the way the laws are written, not just to protect themselves as a profession, but to advance the interests of high net worth individuals. In the offshore world, the exchange is much more direct. Several of the people I spoke to were quite upfront about the fact that they had been approached by the governments of Singapore or Malaysia or Hong Kong, well, back when Hong Kong was still independent, saying, we notice that your professional profile is such that you represent a certain segment of the high net worth client base. We would like to attract those clients. Please tell us what laws we need to write to make our jurisdiction most attractive to them. In fact, why don't you just write up the law and we'll pass it? And that has literally happened. So through some great investigative journalism by organizations like ICIJ, you can get almost a blow-by-blow account of how this happens in places like the BVI. It's quite startling to people who think that the BVI and other places like it are representative democracies. They are technically, but they don't represent popular sovereignty. They're representative of the interests of offshore high net worth individuals. So where does this leave us? Well, I think it's pretty clear at this point that tax policies or any kind of policies that attempt to crack down on the rich have been wildly unsuccessful. Those of you who are policy wonks may be interested in reading a slim volume by an economist named Gabriel Zucman, who was a protege of the French economist Thomas Piketty. He wrote this little book called The Hidden Wealth of Nations, and in it he attempts to estimate exactly how much in tax revenues are lost every year as a result of offshore activity. His figure is 190 billion each year. But one of the things he does is he issues this epic rant against the European Savings Tax Directive. I can explain that more in the Q&A segment, but basically it was an effort to crack down on tax avoidance by the wealthy themselves. And it was such a failure that after 10 years of flailing about, even the EU itself had to admit defeat and repeal it. You may be familiar with what happened when François Hollande became president of France a few years ago. He reinstituted a 75% wealth tax, which among its negative consequences gave the world a picture of the actor Gerard Depardieu giving a wet, sloppy kiss to Vladimir Putin. There's not enough brain bleach in the world to get rid of that one. The reason for that photo was that Gerard Depardieu, who knew that he had enough money to be affected by this policy, but apparently he was not excited about paying a 75% wealth tax, so he renounced his French citizenship, and Vladimir Putin was all too happy to give him a Russian passport. So this is a very common move. Sometimes it's a last resort, but I was even surprised to find that there's a niche industry that exists solely to help high net worth individuals change passports when they run into situations where they're unwilling to submit to this confiscatory wealth policy of their home state. So, cracking down on ultra-mobile people, not going to work, probably never going to work in a Westphalian system. However, there is some indication that policies aimed at working directly with wealth managers are going to be much more successful. They too are mobile, of course, but they're the people who really make things happen. And this is the utility of asking the sociological question, who actually makes these things happen? Because once you know the answer to that, you can think about changing it. So Israel has been a notable case of changing their policies. They're not cracking down on wealth management. In fact, what they've done is they've said, let's cooperate. They've changed the cost-benefit analysis for professionals such that it's much more profitable for them to encourage their clients to cooperate or comply with state laws than to help them evade those state laws. And apparently that has had a salutary effect on the state's tax revenue without anyone going to jail or being penalized. So to conclude, this is what I'm doing, is trying to continue what the Panama Papers have started. I don't really have a horse in this race either way. I don't benefit from anything in particular happening to wealth management. I'm trying to encourage as much as possible public awareness and understanding and really analysis, useful analysis of what's been going on in the offshore world, largely under the radar until things like the Panama Papers have broken and brought them to public awareness. So I have a bunch of scholarly articles, and I've got a book coming out this summer from Harvard University Press called Capital Without Borders that basically recounts and analyzes in depth this 8-year study. I've got a bunch of articles in the popular press in the US and Europe for those who don't have the patience for academic jargon. You can find them at my website up there. I've been fortunate enough to be invited to events such as this and also to address policymakers. So next month I'll be at the OECD Forum in Paris, and funnily enough, the Danish government has discovered me and decided that they might be able to extract some benefit from my tax-funded salary by making me tell them how to chase down wealthy Danish tax evaders. There aren't too many of them, because if you know anything about Denmark, you know that they are like the great white shark of tax enforcement. They don't let anybody get away, and they have very big, sharp teeth. They know everything about everybody, as much as is possible for governments to know. So not too many people evade their authority, but they are deeply troubled by the ones who do, and they want me to come and talk to them about how to find them. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to help, but I'll do my best. When the head of the tax authority in the country of your residence calls you for an audience, you say, "Sir, yes, sir." So with that, I will open for the last half hour of your questions, and thank you for your attention. I'm blinded by these lights in my eyes. Did someone have a hand up? Someone should just talk because I can't see with the lights in my eyes.
Here, we have a question over here.
Oh, good.
Hi. Thanks very much for your talk, Brooke. I found it really interesting. My name is Shawna Levin, and I'm being a little bit exploitative because I'm actually speaking next, so I'm using somebody else's time right now. But I'll do it anyways. I work for an NGO called Global Witness, and we are a London-based organization that works on anti-corruption issues. So I do come at this from a perspective. But I actually just wanted to challenge your assertion, and you know, I understand you might not be on the kind of cusp of the policy debate here, but I think you said that, you know, following David Cameron's 2013 announcement, nothing has been done, and actually that's not true. As of June 30th this year, the UK is going to have a public beneficial ownership registry, and later this year or next year that will be extended to properties purchased by companies in the UK as well. And the EU has also taken steps to have almost public registries. So happy to talk more about this with you later if you're interested, but I just wanted to correct you. Thank you.
Oh, good. So the UK is going to have a public registry for UK citizens or UK structures? Okay. I may be mistaken, but I think Cameron's proposal 3 years ago was for a global registry. So it's certainly a big step in the right direction, and I'm very glad to hear that he's doing this. I think someone from your organization contacted me a couple of months ago. I recognized the name. Yeah. Other questions? I got robbed on the first night I was there. I wasn't even there 12 hours before someone broke into the house that I'd rented. Since I was going to be gone for a long time, I took my little 5-year-old son with me and my mom to look after him while I worked. Whoever broke into the house came into the room where I was sleeping with my son, managed to steal my tablet phone, wake me up, but escape before I could find out who it was. It really scared me. It scared me a lot. There's something about having someone steal from you. I mean, being stolen from is not a pleasant experience under any circumstances, but knowing someone is, you know, a hand's breadth away from you while you're sound asleep with the people most precious to you in the world, and there's nothing you can do about it, that was terrifying. It destroyed the 2 weeks that I spent there. I spent the whole time either talking to the police, to some extent doing my job, but also just looking over my shoulder. One of the most interesting things that happened after that is the day after the robbery, or it happened around 5 in the morning, so I guess it was the same day. After we were done talking to the police, I sort of walked down to the waterfront and I just came across a man who was cleaning his catch, a fisherman who just brought in a bunch of mahi-mahi. And I was just watching him in a daze, and I guess he could see that I was kind of upset, so he said, "What's wrong?" And I explained what had just happened, and he kind of had this chuckle like, "Oh yeah, that happens a lot." And if any of you have ever visited the Cook Islands, you know that the party line is, they say you're more likely to be hit on the head by a coconut than to be a crime in the Cook Islands. Well, that turns out to be pretty out-of-date information too, because come to find out that everyone who actually lives there knows that visitors from abroad, whether they're there for work or pleasure, are like walking dollar signs, and that robbery is a constant hazard. So he said, you know, this is why they call us the Crook Islands, and it's all because when offshore finance came to the Cook Islands, it really changed our culture. And he gave me this sort of disquisition on native Cook Island beliefs, and one of them is you do not harm guests ever. There's great honor in showing your guests, you know, a good time, and certainly of keeping them safe. So to violate that, it isn't just a criminal act, it's a betrayal of the native culture of the place. But he said that something has happened to the Cook Islands, and it's not just the entry of foreigners who brought this new industry. They've changed the actual native culture in a way that is, well, it made him very unhappy. He said, I hate what they've done to my island. I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Did you say, did I find a lot of economic strife in the indigenous population? Yeah. I'm hesitant to speak to that because I didn't speak to any of the actual poor people in those places. I came in and I spoke to people who were highly privileged. But some of the folks that I interviewed had a foot in both worlds. They were natives of the places where they practiced. So one of them was this gentleman from Mossack Fonseca. He had become a wealth manager after a university career organizing the indigenous people of Panama. So he'd been really aligned strongly with people of color and people who were economically underprivileged. And it was sort of ironic to him that he ended up serving some of the most privileged people in the world. And he said that it was with that in mind that he took the risk of lecturing them about inequality and quoting Amartya Sen and Joseph Stiglitz to them. I was surprised that he didn't get dismissed on the spot for pulling stunts like this, but apparently his clients would sit still. When I asked him, you know, if you're so conflicted about this job, why don't you just go back to organizing indigenous people? And he said, well, here's how I think about it. It's very rare that you get face to face with people with so much power and so much economic privilege. I want to use it while I have it to try and open their minds or open their eyes to the world that they live in, because from what I can see, my clients live very isolated lives. They're very suspicious of other people, sometimes with good reason. For some of the reasons I mentioned, like their governments may be corrupt, their own families may be after them in one way or another. So they're not trusting. They live in isolated worlds geographically, spatially. They don't really see the poverty in the world, and they certainly don't see the difference between what they take for granted and what the rest of the world can take for granted. So there are very few people who can speak to them knowledgeably and be taken seriously. I'm one of them, and I want to use that. Another lady I spoke to was a native of the Caribbean, and she said it really bothered her. She who had risen up, she'd gotten educated in England, come back with a law degree, and come to occupy a very prominent position in the wealth management field. And she said, I notice, even now, this was in 2013, to the extent that offshore finance employs local people, it's always in the back rooms. They're never in client-facing positions. I'm a major exception to this rule. And most of the people who come here to the BVI to do wealth management, they're like the old English missionaries of the 19th century, except instead of bringing us religion, they're bringing us wealth management and neoliberalism. So, yes, sir.
I'm Martin Kenny. I live in the British Virgin Islands.
Hello.
And I'm an anti-fraud, anti-corruption, anti-money laundering lawyer and lead a team of 30 doing that kind of work. And then we belong to a network called FraudNet, which has 75 of the world's leading fraud and asset recovery lawyers globally. You said that BVI is not a representative democracy. It may be a technical democracy. No, it's representative of high net worth individuals in the democratic sense. I think this is an overstatement. I think there are qualitative differences between various jurisdictions that are labeled, quote, offshore. Mm-hmm. We have a far greater regulatory framework for our wealth professionals, as you call them, in knowing their customer and accumulating valuable investigative material for the likes of me to get access with disclosure orders from the High Court when I can show justification to get into people's private affairs in order to stop debt avoidance, as you call it, or fraudsters hiding the fruits of fraud. I object because of the notion that the offshore world is to be, quote, blamed for some aspects of moral outrage that folks onshore have as to onshore tax policy when we have structures that are regulated, and when onshore there are dark holes like Delaware and Nevada and Wyoming, which give us as fraud lawyers far greater problems than BVI structures.
I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying. The hypocrisy of the onshore world is just, it really takes a lot of brass for my country, the United States, or Great Britain to be lecturing to any offshore entity about how they need to regulate themselves. I mean, it's been demonstrated by my colleagues in political science over and over and over again that, if anything, the offshore world is much more tightly regulated than, say, any US state. If you really want to get away with something, go to one of the onshore jurisdictions. Or at least you have to go through one of them in order to make good use of the offshore world. So I'm not only sympathetic, I am familiar with evidence that proves what you're saying. If any of you are interested, there's a really interesting book by a colleague of mine named Jason Sharman called Havens in a Storm. It was published by Cornell University Press in 2006. And it was an investigation of precisely this issue. Sharman has also done a study for the World Bank that showed if you really want to get away with something, what you do is you call up a firm in like South Dakota or Wyoming where they won't even ask you for any ID. Or Sharman was actually offered the opportunity to use the US Social Security number of some of the employees in this South Dakota office in order to open up an offshore structure without him having to disclose his true identity. The shenanigans are just mind-boggling. So we're absolutely on the same page about this. I can understand why when the OECD comes knocking and says we're going to blacklist you if you don't comply, many of the offshore jurisdictions just say, oh, get stuffed, you hypocrites. On the other hand, my experience of the BVI was second only to that of the Cook Islands in terms of the sense of personal threat. It's the only place I was ever threatened with deportation by a gentleman I interviewed. He was kind enough to speak to me. I'm not sure why he bothered, but he started off the interview by telling me that he thought I was, some kind of commie leftist liberal, and that he took real umbrage at the fact that I suggested that his work had anything to do with global inequality. So I nodded, I explained my motivations, much as I've done in this talk, and he talked to me for about 40 minutes answering my questions, and I thought that was the end of it, but no, he wasn't done with me. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms and sort of went back to the subject of what a commie, leftist, liberal agitator I was. And then he said, many of us in the BVI, when we heard you were coming, when you contacted us for interviews, we talked about having you thrown off the island because of your writings. And at first I was just so shocked I didn't know what to say. I sort of went blank for a moment because I thought, well, what on earth would this fellow have to do with the border control of a whole country? Surely he's deluded in terms of his power. So I just sort of did the thing that many of us would do, which is just, smile politely, shake hands, thank him for his time. And then I found out later that actually he did have the power to do this. It's been done before. I believe David, did you mention having been deported from somewhere? Was it Bermuda?
I lived in Bermuda from 1990 to 96, and I was essentially kicked off the island, but in the most civilized of manners. I can remember I was at my desk at home on the phone, and two very smartly dressed people appeared at my window, and I thought they were Jehovah's Witnesses. So I made a hand gesture just to sort of hang on for a few minutes. I finished my call, and they were actually from the immigration department. They gave me a letter that said, you must leave the island, by a certain time on a certain date. But, to be perfectly honest, I've never been overly resentful because, as with all small countries, they're more conscious about their image in the outside world. For example, if there's like one murder on a small island, the entire island gets tainted. If there's one murder in the United States doesn't get tainted. So I could see that the last thing the country wanted, was a bald-headed Welshman running around with an attitude, looking under the carpet and exposing serious financial crime. I mean, I could fully understand their position. If I'd been in a position of authority, I probably would have taken the same decision, because that's just the reality of life.
There was a journalist named Leah McGrath Goodman, who works for Newsweek, who was deported from, I think it was Guernsey. It might have been Jersey, one of the two Channel Islands, one of those two Channel Islands. And she wasn't even investigating financial crime. She was investigating allegations of child abuse at an orphanage. And she was successfully deported and, in fact, barred from re-entering not only the Channel Islands, but the UK for several years. She got it overturned eventually, but the idea of sort of in line with what David is saying, is that any sort of negative publicity is regarded as a threat to the financial services industry. So I guess my point and my experience is that threatening people who come to ask questions about your business is not conducive to giving an impression of openness. It would have been better for this gentleman either to decline to speak to me or simply not to tell me that I had been targeted for deportation. It seemed like he said that in a way that was intended to sort of let me know that I was under threat, and he succeeded. I don't think that does much for the image of the BVI as an open and transparent place.
More recently in the BVI, I mean very recently, I think over the last few weeks, a journalist from Canada had scheduled an interview with the governor, flew to the BVI immediately from Puerto Rico, and was deported because he disclosed he was there to work, had according to him, taken all reasonable steps to receive the appropriate permissions, and had an interview scheduled with the governor, and despite that was deported immediately. I think he spent 1 hour in the BVI, and that does not reflect well on the BVI at all. I don't know whether people locally were applauding this, but as somebody who lives outside of the BVI looking on, it portrays an absolutely awful image of your jurisdiction.
Other questions?
Hello? Sorry.
I think the facts need to be straightened out on that episode, David. The young journalist in question is with the Toronto Star. He called me a week before. I told him, because he said he was coming down to interview some people. He wanted to interview me. I said, that's fine. I said, you have to have a temporary work permit to enter the BVI to do work as a journalist. That's the law. You got to fill out the right forms. You got to get them in on time. It's a real process. The reality is the young lad filled the forms out on a Friday and arrived on Monday. And he wasn't deported. He wasn't allowed in because he didn't have a work permit in place before he decided to fly all the way from Toronto down. And then he used it as an embarrassing story to take a shot at the BVI. I do agree that what happened to you, our speaker, is insidious and outrageous, that somebody in the financial services sector in our community would threaten you. You should have just had my business card, because I would have gone down the High Court way and got an injunction in your favor if somebody tries to mess with people and their rights. We have a Constitution. Visitors have rights under the Constitution. We have laws, and we have a High Court that doesn't play games with respect to law.
Just to respond to that, Martin, first off, a journalist should not need any special dispensation to go to the BVI and interview anyone, much like if a BVI journalist comes to this conference, he doesn't need a special work permit, or she doesn't need a special work permit to interview somebody. It's fundamentally absurd. And he did actually go to the BVI. You know, he was in the BVI for 1 hour, and according to him, he did take appropriate steps, was given the runaround. I think he was told that he needed some sort of filming permit or something. But, you know, you really shouldn't have to jump through hoops just to interview the governor unless you're insecure.
We have a question over here, and then one over here in the front, David.
To change the subject back slightly, beneficial ownership registers. I was interested in what you said about Brazil, and the fact that people go find information and then sort of go, oh, you're rich, I'll kidnap your son. One of the issues that has been sort of brought up in the context of public beneficial ownership registers are that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And just as a sort of update on where beneficial ownership information is going. I'm from Solomon Harris in the Cayman Islands, and the Cayman Islands recently signed up with the UK to actually have a register which is fundamentally accessible by both tax authorities. So that seems to be a direction that's being followed by more jurisdiction than going down the public route, because of some of these fears about kidnap and what people might do if that information were public.
Right, and I'm really glad you raised that point. Did everyone hear what the question was, or the comment was about the fact that many people who are high net worth or well-to-do all over the world are vulnerable? You know, they're vulnerable to some really bad people. Some of those people may be in their own governments, they may be criminal gangs, they may be their own family members. That's one of the reasons that I don't really take a pro or anti-wealth management stand. I mean, I'm glad there is someone trying to protect people from being kidnap victims or extortion victims. That's a good thing. And your point was that in the Cayman Islands, they're trying to kind of split the difference between the need for transparency for tax authorities and also the need to protect people's human rights to safety and not becoming the targets of criminals by having registries of beneficial ownership that are accessible only on sort of to government officials with a valid reason. So they're not truly public in the sense that anyone could go look them up. I'm not opposed to solutions like that, and I wonder if that's where things are going to go worldwide. Some of the people I interviewed think that that is the way of the future.
Question from back here. I'm sorry, straight ahead back.
Hi.
I heard your description of a self-image of the social worker for the rich as the wealth manager, and followed the Alzheimer's ravaged old person and the wealth manager taking care of their interests. But at the same time, I also look to the David Camerons of the world and the Mitt Romneys of the world, and I wonder, by focusing, in fact, on the wealth managers, whether you're alleviating personal responsibility from the David Camerons and the Mitt Romneys and the others who clearly are capable, whereas the little old person with the Alzheimer's is not, but they are capable of putting their foot down and saying, no, this is not the right thing to be doing.
Oh, for sure. I don't mean to say that we shouldn't look at wealthy people, or at states for that matter. My point was that the account which only looks at those usual suspects is incomplete, because it's left out this crucial group of professionals who sort of mediate the relationship between elites and states. But of course, someone like Cameron could say, no, I want no part of this. Absolutely. I'm not trying to relieve them of responsibility at all. Sorry if I was unclear on that.
Hi, Polly Springer from Eversheds in London. Like Martin, I'm a fraud lawyer.
Hi.
I have a question really directed to both you and David. I wonder, your work predated the Panama Papers, I take it.
Yes.
And David, you gave a really helpful rundown of all the representation from people from different countries who are here. I just wondered if that Star Wars bar has changed a little bit this year. Are the wealth managers not so much in attendance? Are they quieter than they have been in previous conferences? Since the Panama Papers have been leaked, is there much less or even a greater resistance to having any kind of public profile?
I think the conference organizers would be in a better position than I to
yeah,
answer
well,
that question.
Yeah, she was addressing that to me. I haven't noticed any change in the composition of the attendees. All I can say is when the Panama Papers came out, I was ecstatic. I mean, as the organizer of an event like this, the Panama Papers happened long enough before our conference so that we could benefit from it, short enough before our conference for it still to be newsworthy. And by the way, one thing I omitted in my opening was that I tried like a devil to get Ramon Fonseca to come to this conference and sit on the same panel with Gerard Ryle, the head of the ICIJ, which coordinated the Panama Papers project. And quite frankly, if I was the owner of a company and somebody had, well, my own database was actually hacked and leaked recently, if somebody had given me the opportunity to be on a panel with, the hacker or somebody who was associated with the hacker, or in the case of the Panama Papers, I think it was a leak, not a hack, you could not have stopped me from coming here and really, sticking up for my company, my reputation. He declined, and I tried all sorts of mental angles, right, to appeal to different aspects of his psyche. And he didn't want to come here. He accused, I don't know if Gerard Ryle is here, but he said something along the lines of, in an email he wrote this, "I do not want to share a stage, with that criminal." I'm actually going to read his entire email, before the Panama Papers session. But I haven't noticed, to answer your question, any change in composition. It boosted our event, it increased numbers, but I don't know if it was a broad section of people who attended as a result of it. We didn't get any cancellations anyway.
We have a question here.
Just wanted to clarify what happened with Leah McGrath Goodman. She wasn't actually deported or held in Jersey or Guernsey. They managed to get the English authorities to pull her at Heathrow. 10 hours in solitary and then back to the States.
Oh, just 10 hours of solitary. Okay.
Yeah. No lawyer, no US, no US legal assistance, no embassy assistance. That was very, very special treatment. Now, quite how Jersey managed to get the English to do that, I don't know, but there's something really rather unwholesome there. But she has since worked it out and been over.
Thanks for the clarification.
I'd like to raise a different question. It's the question of the ethics of the lawyers involved in the offshore business, particularly asset protection. We are, as lawyers, officers of the court. Our job is to get people to obey the law, not to avoid and evade the law. And when you have a system that allows for asset protection against legitimate court judgments, what's going on is there's a two-tier justice system. Some working guy who's sued will have his home taken away, his bank account taken away, because he has no ability to put his assets beyond the reach of the law. Now, in New York, the New York Bar Association has said that it's unethical for a lawyer to help a foreign client break the laws of his own country. And that's a proposition that's serious, because if lawyers are to make the laws of a country work, they have to be helping the legal system of their own country. And here we have people who are trying to figure out how to undermine the legal systems not only of their own country, but other countries. I wonder if you've thought about that.
I have thought about it. There's a chapter in my book on wealth management in the state, and one of the things I quote in there is an offhanded observation that the economist Thomas Piketty made, actually in the introduction to that book by Zuckman that I mentioned. He said something that seems very prescient in light of the current US presidential election and events in Europe right now in the political sphere. What you're alluding to would be called, in my field, a question of political legitimacy. I don't know if you think about it this way, but listening to you speak about lawyers as officers of the court and their ethical obligations, I start thinking about the big picture here, which is if people become convinced, if the general public become convinced that there is, as you say, a two-tiered legal system, one for the rich and one for everybody else, what you have is a problem of loss of faith in government, whether it's a democracy or any other structure. And when you get loss of faith in the legitimacy of government, Piketty says, you start seeing a movement towards or preference for authoritarian regimes. And so he lays some of the recent post-crisis evidence of this two-tiered legal system at the prevalence of ultra-right-wing, xenophobic, ultra-nationalist political movements throughout Europe and now in the United States.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, just a quick question in relation to the jurisdictional arbitrage point you were making.
Yeah.
Do you think any of the current rhetoric around having more transparency, whether it's in a UK setting, US setting, or globally, will actually work? The reason I ask is I remember talking to a Monegasque lawyer. Now, I'm not an expert in the law of Monaco, so please clarify if anyone can, who was very proudly telling me that he doesn't really have to do anything sensible in relation to Monaco in terms of disclosing true ownership or who his clients are. So it would be very legitimate for him to be recorded as the beneficial owner of all kinds of structures one can imagine around the world. And he's not breaking law in Monaco. And as long as everyone else has got their KYC correct in terms of a copy of his passport and a utility bill, everyone's very happy. I suppose it's an example of the structures designed to operate within the letter of the law but violating the spirit of it. So my question is do you think, despite the impetus around the world at the moment, there will ever genuinely be a practical difference going forward?
I'm pretty cynical about that, but I would be more than happy to be wrong. I mean, I've seen, in other domains of legal and cultural life, enormous changes just in my lifetime. So perhaps they will occur in this area too. But one of the gentlemen that I interviewed for the study, when I asked him what he likes most about his job, he says, you know what I really like? I like playing cat and mouse with revenue authorities. That's fun. And I said, well, did you ever think about going to work for them? Like to, go work for the government, at least temporarily? And he laughed at me. He said, no, nobody ever does that. People who go into private wealth management, it's not a revolving door as there are in many professions where people go back and forth between private sector and government. He said it's a one-way street. If anything, either people just start off in the private sector and stay there, or they go from government to private sector wealth management because the fees, the salaries are just so much better in private practice. And he says one of the consequences of that is that he said the smartest people end up working for the high net worth clients, and the people who can't get employed or who choose for ethical reasons to stay employed in the government sector, they're always one step behind. So no matter what they come up with, he said, we're always one step ahead of them. They think they're closing the loopholes, but we're already busy finding the next ones. Having said that, some of the people I spoke to said, privacy is dead, secrecy is dead. Where we're really going to see the growth of our profession is in organizing multinational payrolls and pensions, because we're in a globalized workforce. You'll see more and more business arrangements where you have, say, an offshore project going on that employs people from 15 different jurisdictions. Nobody wants the headache of being involved with the pension and payroll laws of those 15 jurisdictions. So what we do that nobody else can do is, as wealth managers, we set up the structures to make it as legally simple as possible, to just pay people net and let them worry about their own obligations to their own states. So maybe the focus will simply shift, but no one I talk to thinks wealth management is dead or even ill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brooke. A couple of more anecdotes. I was in the Cayman Islands in the late 1990s. I took the opportunity of going to see the Legislative Assembly, which was in session. There was one local journalist in the press box who I knew her. I went to say hello. They had a recess of the Legislative Assembly. The leader of government business at the time, Truman Bodden, met with Richard Coles, the Attorney General, in the recess about having me deported from the island just for being in the press box. A member of the Legislative Assembly, who I was friendly with, ran up the stairs. He said, "We're taking you to a safe house." I mean, it's pretty wacky. I was whisked to the safe house on the basis that if they couldn't find me, they couldn't deport me. And then later that night, I got to my hotel room, and there was a message from somebody I didn't know. Hardly anyone knew I was even on the island, from somebody saying that he was on the verge of being kicked out of the island. I was the only person he'd been told who could possibly help him. I think it was a teacher. And then a Wall Street Journal editor, quite a senior guy at the Wall Street Journal, went to the Cayman Islands to follow up a story, and I told him, while you're there, you've got to pop into the Legislative Assembly just to see how it works down there. And he had his notebook confiscated by security as he went into the building because he was not an accredited journalist in the Cayman Islands. And I would say, that you don't really want to be doing that if you want to be taken seriously in the outside world. It's a bit on the Mickey Mouse side, in my opinion. Anyway, we're going to take a break, and then when we come back, there's a session that at least 40% of everyone in attendance will enjoy immensely, Hypocrisy USA, the country's role as a money laundering center and offshore tax haven.